Hi, I'm Sandora Alford-Purvis, and one of my roles at the moment is working as the Executive Director for the Society for Organic Urban Land Care. I'm joining you this evening from my home in Ottawa, Ontario, in Canada, where I live and work on unceded Algonquin lands. Thank you for joining us for a Cultivating Awareness within the Land Care and Horticultural Industry. It's the 5th learning session in the SOUL series on the role of horticulture in cultivating social and land equity. This series has been developed in part through the generous support of Gaia College. Over the last few months, we've heard some stories about some of the ways that horticultural and agricultural spaces, especially within urban settings, are experienced and how those experiences can vary based on physical appearance and or cultural values of people in those spaces. Back in November, Isaac spoke about bringing Indigenous gardening back to the land at Evergreen Brickworks and creating a place that welcomes and engages an Indigenous community that had not felt welcome in that space before. Cheyenne spoke about the barriers faced by BIPOC youth in finding education, support, or resources around growing food, whether for community building or for creating a livelihood, and the race and socioeconomic exclusion inherent in many established paths to becoming a grower. Aaliyah spoke about how differently semi-public spaces are experienced by Black people or people of color and anyone else who doesn't fit security guards' perception of who belongs in those spaces. And Lorraine highlighted some of what is considered normal and acceptable in gardens and how people who push back against those are socially or even legally punished. Tiffany addressed how even discussing returning lands currently legally held by individuals or various levels of Canadian government to Indigenous stewardship does meet with shock and rejection in many spaces. So in this session, we're going to circle back to how these experiences are influenced by the work and choices of those of us who are within the horticultural community, sometimes in ways that are not immediately obvious, and how we can seed and nurture some alternative patterns. I will talk about big systemic shifts, which will take time to grow if they're going to last, and the more immediate actions and changes that can help alleviate some of the most immediate pressure points that people are experiencing. This session will delve into creating change within our own personal and professional networks and within our own work and actions. Next month's session will look at cultivating more diverse community relationships. So this one's inward, next month is going to be more outward facing. When it comes to building awareness within our own spaces, there is no getting away from the reality that bringing up topics around race and equity makes people who have sort of inherited the benefits of those inequities really uncomfortable. I've also observed that the more firmly convinced participants in a space are that that space is already welcoming and inclusive, the more immediate and vociferous the pushback seems to be when topics of exclusion are brought up. People don't want to believe it. If asked, most people who haven't personally been or been made to feel excluded from spaces would say that gardens, gardening, and parklands are welcoming and inclusive. They're for everyone. But as we've seen in media coverage of 911 calls for the crimes of birdwatching, jogging, or having a barbecue in the park, and as we heard from the last few speakers in this series, horticulture, agriculture, and urban public spaces are not exempt from overt and covert forms of exclusion based on visible race or socioeconomic status. When confronting the most severe eruptions of sort of racial profiling or economic exclusion, the agreement that it has to stop immediately is immediate and nearly universal, despite what some comment sections might imply. But media-worthy incidents are the very top of the pyramid. To take it down entirely, rather than just knock the top off and then have it come back, it's the bricks at the bottom that need to be removed. And there are a lot more of them, but they do happen to be much easier for most of us to reach. And by framing the challenges of disassembling this as something that we can actually have capacity to help to resolve, these challenges become less a topic of blame and shame and more just challenges that we can work to solve. And when first coming to these topics, so just bringing up who's in this space, there's some questions to sort of we can ask ourselves, or I've also found some ways just to be good starting points when broaching a topic and running into that, oh no, that's not here response. So trying to figure out, where we have capacity to make change when we look at these large issues, very often the first step is just learning to observe and identify what is around us, the things that are within our reach. And this is what I described back in the October session like 6 months ago, is seeing the water. The coming off that concept that the fish don't know what water is. Hopefully the speakers over the last few months have helped make the water that we're sort of swimming in a little bit more visible to us. And some opening questions to sort of ask. And these are questions, start by asking ourselves. And then as you start to get a sense of what's going on, then you start to have conversations with people about it. So a question to ask is, in your own space, who do I see here? At Landscape Ontario, so the Horticultural Trade Association, the largest one in the world, the wall of past presidents all appear to be white. I don't know if they have other backgrounds, but looking at the photos, having stood in the library one day waiting for a taxi, they all appeared to be white, and only 2 of them were women. But this is a symptom. It's not caused by the association. It's just a symptom, since it is a representation of the situation that exists throughout the industry. So I used an example photo that I thought was appropriate to use, because that is being the green turtleneck, and that was the board that I sat on for the local chapter of Landscape Ontario. And like most of the industry, there's not enough variation there. There's a bit, but there could be a lot more to be representative. The next question to ask, beyond just who's here, is who are the business owners? The sea of faces at trade shows like Landscape Ontario Congress is predominantly white, despite the event being hosted in one of the most multicultural cities in the world, so Toronto. Admittedly, I haven't been there in about 4 years, but I don't think it's changed all that much in sort of that time frame. And I certainly, when I went looking on the website for information or examples of the crowd, I couldn't really see that much of a shift since last time I was there. Next, another question to ask is, who are the clients? So in creating the horticultural industry and sort of shaping it over time, and the garden world in general, how have our choices around service models either invited in or excluded people from horticultural services? Is it structured to suit a particular socioeconomic demographic, and is that socioeconomic demographic fairly restricted in who's included in it? Who are the workers is another important question to ask. This is where you'll find more visible diversity, and it's among the workers, not the owners. And what the question I would ask is, what are the systemic and social structures that keep people from moving from the employee role to the owner role, especially in a field that on the surface looks like it has a really low barrier of entry to business startups? That's how most landscape business owners started, as they were an employee and then they moved into being a business owner. They started their own business. But why is that not happening for a much broader demographic than what we're seeing? Another question, and this is one I've observed as well, is who are the students? Most of the visible minorities in the horticultural industry program I taught in over the last 3 years were international students. The Canadian residents presented as white far beyond what would be representative of Ontario's demographics. So why isn't working with land and plants something that people from a diversity of backgrounds feel is open or inviting? What are the social, cultural, or financial barriers to coming into that? Also, who appears in advertising? This is something I brought up that I started thinking about when I was trying to communicate to somebody within my personal circle that racial exclusion did exist in their particular field, because I was talking also about it existing in my particular field. And they just kind of didn't see it. And I was kind of finally hit on, well, actually, go look at who's in the advertising. They were in a buying role, so they had access to sort of catalogs and information, and there was clothing associated with it. And so look who's in the advertising. It's a place to start to ask questions, just to kind of go, who's here? Hardware stores, you know, if you look at most of the pictures up on the walls, the big ones, it's mostly men. It's starting to shift though. But these are subtle implications. Advertising often invites us to see ourselves in a place and engaging in an activity or using a product. It also implies who it's for. So camping and outdoors equipment suppliers, that being the media, they recently started evaluating who was shown in their ads and catalogs. And the conclusion was that it didn't well represent a diversity of demographics. Not only does that subtly exclude people by making anyone not shown feel uninvited, it also sort of subtly indicates who's allowed in those spaces. So we're saying something when we design our advertising. Also, even the spaces themselves. What are the cultures or values that are being represented? This ties back a little bit to Lorraine's content in last month's talk. But I'd say especially in the public spaces or in any communications or educational materials, we've begun to consider physical accessibility in designs of spaces, but can we actually broaden that conversation further to include cultural accessibility? And what are the cultural or socioeconomic stories that are being told through the landscape? When Isaac Crosby asked Indigenous people in Toronto why they weren't visiting the evergreen brickworks, the response was that it was too much of a Western European colonial space. They did not feel comfortable or welcome in the space. And it was the design of the space. It can indicate who it's intended for. And the primary influence of horticultural styles and practices within Canada are Europe and the UK. That leaves a lot of people and cultures excluded. And then there's some things that are really out of sight when we're sort of asking the question of who's here or who's represented. There's certain things that are out of sight for many of us who are in urban spaces. And one of those is who grew the plants. A lot of the large production nurseries now rely on temporary foreign workers who are paid minimum wage or just a little bit above and don't have access to citizenship in the country that they're traveling to, often leaving families for months and months at a time, staying in housing conditions that are up to legal standards but not up to most people's expectations, for not very good wages, and they are not allowed access to citizenship process. So that's where there's been a growing call for status for all, so that everybody who comes here to work here gets to also be here if they choose to start a citizenship process. But that question of who grew these plants is one worth asking. Another one is, where did these materials come from? So were they sourced without consent from unceded land or from countries with poor worker protections? Who processed the materials? Who will deal with them when or if they're removed from the site? Will they go through a waste stream? Are they going to be exported? Are there plastics involved that aren't recyclable? Where did the materials come from and where will they end up is another big, big question to ask. And noticing what is around us is a good start. It takes time to start to recognize sort of the deeper patterns that are under some of the surface situations. It also isn't always easy to spot things that have become so normal to those of us who are sort of welcomed into a space that those things just fade into the background. It does often take those who've been excluded from or harmed by a pattern or practice to identify and define it. To start to sort of notice more, I do recommend following the work or social media accounts of BIPOC thinkers and leaders, and BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color, or of community projects that are BIPOC-led and centered, that can help make situations that are not immediately obvious from the outside a lot more apparent. There is an aside I'm going to toss in here, and I'll get it more into these topics in April when we're delving into questions of community. But if you're following people on social media to learn more about perspectives that are not necessarily the ones we originate from or have a lot of experience with, please don't argue with the posters if they make statements that you disagree with. Do feel free to unfollow. We're not always ready to feel to engage with everything. We're on a continuum and a process. And also, just because somebody is from a marginalized background doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they say, or that I'll ever agree with everything they say. So feel free to unfollow if they're saying stuff and you just can't bear not engaging with it. But listen for a while first before directly engaging. Go ahead and share if you're inspired. Respond to specific requests or offer or make specific offers of services or resources. If there's something where you see they're working on something, you're like, you know what, I have exactly what you're looking for. But there is something to avoid, which is a lot of people who are working on things, projects sort of from inside communities, do end up fielding offers that sound something like this. I really like what you're doing, and I have ideas about how it could be even better, which is intended to be helpful, but it does suggest to the people in the middle of the project that they know less about it than somebody from the outside of it looking at the project does. And people who even really politely do decline unsolicited offers of collaboration are often subjected to really angry backlash or rejection. Next month, as I said, we'll get a lot more into recommendations about engaging directly on various issues without sort of offloading our more emotional or educational work onto the people already dealing with exclusion and inequity. But as a starting point, I highly recommend just listening quietly. It takes a while to sort of integrate different ways of communicating when we're not familiar with them. But getting back to the topic of asking questions. One of the first barriers that these questions do often encounter is it can be difficult to find answers to them. So you go through your list of questions and you ask them, and it's like, but I can't find out. They're not the types of topics that are included in FAQ pages or product descriptions. It's a lot like trying to ask what the ecological or life cycle aspects of products and practices. There's few, if any, immediate answers to be found. But the asking, just doing the asking plants a seed, both in our own personal perceptions of kind of going, why can't I find that answer? Or I assumed it would be obvious, but it's not, and so that makes me wonder what's out of sight. But it also plants a seed with whoever you're asking. So if you're talking to a supplier and you're like, oh, where does this come from? And they can't really tell you either, then they may start to go, wait a second, what's missing from this information? Why can't I find that? And also the difficulty in finding answers, it may also help to highlight the value of shortening supply chains to make it easier to learn about and to tell the stories of the plants and the materials and the ideas that we're working with. Where did they come from? And the answers that we can find to these questions do often lead to immediate next question. Why? Why does advertising trend strongly towards white ladies for gardening ads and white men for landscape supplies? Well, because they are the majority of decision makers in those spaces. Why isn't there more diversity in these spaces? Well, that's the really big question. Isaac and Cheyenne and Leah each did highlight some of the specific factors and underlying causes. I'll add a few more pieces of the puzzle today, but there will remain big and open-ended questions because everything's connected and it's complicated, and that's okay. We just work away a bit at a time. And that brings us to that question of where does the work start? As the things that were previously outside of our notice begin to become more apparent, the desire to start to help can be pretty strong. But before rushing out to sort of engage in diverse communities, there is something to consider. These issues aren't BIPOC issues or issues of people who've been pushed to social, environmental, and economic margins. These are societal issues. So in the context of this series, they are issues of horticulture, of landholders, and of those of us who have created or who repeat the established narrative of what urban green spaces are supposed to be. And that brings us to the first of the topics that I said would be covered in this section.